most, say, adaptation is due to fine tune? Like, would you agree that natural selection is like a fine tuning process, or like a selection process? Would you say?
I would say that, okay, so to answer your question, because I'm not entirely sure how to unearth that question necessarily, but I'll answer the question this way. I would say that natural selection is a process by which organisms that obtain beneficial mutations via mutation or some other means
Okay,
are
can you
selected
give me
over
an
are
but,
selected over. Can I
okay,
finish?
and I just want to stop it when you said beneficial, because I gave an example of a beneficial mutation, but it was clearly due to a loss of information. So I want to know if there's any truly beneficial mutations that are not ultimately deleterious, and that
So
actually, increase, say, the genetic information, and make it better overall. And then, you
okay,
know,
so before I answer that question, right? What
yeah.
specifically do you mean by deleterious? By deleterious, do you mean that it alters the function of the original gene, or that it actually deletes information within the existing genome?
Do you want to talk about like a specific mutation in regards to that, like a point mutation, inversion,
No.
insertion, frame shift, something like that, or do you just want like a basic
I just want a basic
description of?
definition. Like, so for instance, right?
I think it's pretty simple. I just gave an example of a population of winged beetles that lost their wings. They lost their information for wings. Now they have a selective advantage, but it's based on a degenerated adaptation. That's pretty clear that
Right,
that's ultimately deleterious. Go ahead.
right. So once again, that triggers the same question. So is that particular phenomenon based upon the inactivation of that gene? Is that due to something within the genetic code that has changed? Or
Exactly.
is
Like I
that
said,
something?
God created pre-existing heterozygosity, he created pre-existing design variations. So if we're seeing these new traits arising based on pre-existing information, that's more consistent with biblical creation and more
Okay,
inconsistent with fish to fisherman evolution. And that's the whole topic. What kind of change do we see? Do we see limits? Do we see adaptations and variations based on a loss of information? Because that's more consistent with both genetic entropy, second law of thermodynamics, and biblical creation. I mean, that's what we predict. Everything we see is so consistent. It's actually amazing. Go ahead.
well, okay, entropy doesn't really apply here, and I'll
I'm
ask it
talking
one more
about
time.
entropy on a biological level, right? The
Yeah, it
accumulation of
doesn't.
individual mutations.
It still doesn't apply.
How come? What's your
Okay.
definition of the word entropy?
Okay. Okay. First of all, before I answer that question, are you familiar with what entropy refers to and how it refers to the system?
So, are we going to look at, say, the second law of thermodynamics,
Sure.
that energy increases as matter or energy becomes less usable, right? Like the energy available, say, for useful work in a functioning system does tend to decrease, even though the total energy remains constant. So really,
Well,
in
sure.
general,
Stop for a second.
the second law of thermodynamics predicts that a system left to itself will, in the course of time, go toward greater disorder. I mean, have you ever seen your hair in the morning? That's
Well,
entropy right there.
okay. Except for there's another issue that you're forgetting to mention, right? And that is the fact that entropy only applies to closed systems.
No,
And
no,
the
no.
human
I'm
body is
talking.
not a closed system.
The word entropy is it's I
Yes,
love when evolutionists say this. The word entropy, like, it's just like the word evolution. It can
yes,
mean and
but
apply to different things. Hey, the
yes,
evolution of languages. It doesn't mean that language is evolving in the biological
right,
sense. But I'm talking about biological evolution. I'm talking about the accumulation of near neutral and deleterious
right.
mutations. Much like rust on a car degrades a car, much like these mutations degrade a genome. That's all I mean by entropy. So it's a straw man to say that I'm trying to
Well, you're
imply that the
saying
second
you're,
law has to do with that. Go ahead.
what you seem to be implying is that there is a loss of information because the amount of genetic information within an organism is fixed throughout its existence, which, as I've demonstrated, isn't necessarily the case. People get viral infections. Some people occasionally have gene duplication. Some people have even, Turner syndrome, Down syndrome,
Okay,
cases in
so
which the polyploidy of an organism is changed.
Okay, so we talked about polyploidy, we talked about gene duplication. Are you talking about these viruses? Are you talking about the endogenous retroviruses, like that inserted genetic material, AK and ERV, into, say, ape ancestors or other, or is that what you're saying is the addition of information, or am I mistaken?
Any viral infection can cause an addition to information, right? If
Okay,
I
but like, if we look at, say, we'll just use endogenous retroviruses for example, if they're found to have function, wouldn't that indicate that it was highly unlikely that they were inserted by retroviruses? And here's the important part: functional endogenous retroviruses, say an endogenous retrovirus that plays a role in, say, the placenta or the embryo, that would actually depend very heavily, and we might be able to agree on this, on their position and their sequence. That means if they were positional and positioned slightly wrong, or they had the wrong sequence, they wouldn't be functional. But the fact that we see function would point to design rather than, say, a genetic marker that proves common ancestry. Go ahead.
Well, okay. So the first issue with that necessarily is that you're starting from the top, taking a top bottom approach. Whereas, let's say I get infected with some virus, right? And that particularly this virus is beneficial and it gets passed down. It's more likely to be the case that the virus, as it travels through the body and replicates, or the body as it continues on through its cycle, if it is indeed beneficial, will find a place where this virus is useful and will engage in sites that are symbiotic towards both the organism and the virus.
Yeah, but it's position. Like I said, if they were positional and positioned slightly wrong, or even the wrong sequence, they wouldn't be functional. So the fact that what you're saying, I see that more as a rescue device, because you've seen that these ERVs are now functional, and now you're real much like the non-protein coding regions we find that are actually transcribed, say, into RNA and revealing, say, functions and the trajectories looking towards function. I feel like that's the evolutionists trying to come up with an explanation, because that seems like
Well,
a very
what we're
big
doing
chance.
fundamentally, what we're doing fundamentally is explaining different explanations that we have. You're saying that I'm coming up with an excuse. I'm saying that based upon selective pressures like pH, based upon where particular resources that a virus may have that an organism may not have on its own, can dictate where a virus may be likely to be found in an organism as opposed to where it's not.
Well, okay. Would you agree, though, that these endogenous retroviruses do have functional roles, say, in the placenta and in the embryo? Like, would you agree with that?
Sure, before I